Welcome to episode 8. This episode focuses on making sense of data. I think this is one of the most important stages in the entire doctorate, because this is where information gradually becomes knowledge. One pattern that still surprises me is how many students expect analysis to provide immediate answers, as though data somehow reveals the truth automatically. In reality, analysis is usually much more gradual than that. This episode is about understanding why. And before we begin, let's briefly look back. This slide reminds us where we've come from. In episode 7, we explored the realities of collecting data. Now the challenge changes. You have information. What does it mean? I think that is a wonderful question, because collecting information and understanding information are two very different activities. And that naturally brings us to where you are in the journey. This slide captures a very common experience. The data collection phase is ending. Many students expect answers. Instead, they often encounter confusion. One thing I wish more students understood is that confusion at this stage is often completely normal. You're moving from gathering evidence to interpreting evidence. That is a different skill altogether. And that naturally leads us to our first myth. This slide addresses something I see repeatedly. Many doctoral students believe analysis will reveal clear answers. Reality is rarely that simple. I've lost count of the number of times students have said, "I've got all the data now, surely the hard part is over." Very often, the opposite is true. Analysis introduces a completely different challenge, because data rarely speaks for itself. And that naturally creates another experience, feeling overwhelmed. This slide captures a feeling that many students recognize immediately. Too much information, too many possibilities. The challenge is deciding what matters. I remember one candidate who told me, "I have hundreds of pages of transcripts and I don't know where to begin." That feeling is very common. Analysis is not about using everything. It's about identifying what is significant. That leads directly to one of the most important distinctions in doctoral research. I think this is one of the most important slides in this episode. Description is not analysis. The questions become: what patterns exist? What relationships emerge? Why does this matter? One pattern that still surprises me is how often students stop at description. Description tells us what happened. Analysis helps explain why it matters. That is where doctoral thinking begins to develop. And once we understand that, we naturally start searching for patterns. This slide introduces the mindset of analysis. Researchers seek similarities, differences, themes, contradictions. One thing I wish more students understood is that analysis is often detective work. You're looking for signals without complexity. I've become increasingly convinced that curiosity is one of the most important assets at this stage, because curiosity keeps you asking questions. And another challenge also emerges: your own biases. I really like this slide because it introduces intellectual honesty. Researchers are human. Good analysis requires intellectual honesty. I've supervised many excellent doctoral students over the years. The strongest ones were often willing to be surprised. One pattern that still surprises me is how easily we can become attached to our own expectations. But research sometimes tells us something different, and we have to be willing to listen. Which leads us to another valuable source of learning: contradictions. This slide contains something that I strongly believe in. Conflicting findings may reveal complexity and new understanding. I remember one student who became worried because some of the findings appeared inconsistent. My response was simple. Reality is often inconsistent. Contradictions are not always problems. Sometimes they are where the most interesting insights are found. And once contradictions appear, another responsibility emerges: decision making. This slide introduces something that sits at the centre of doctoral development. Analysis involves judgment. Which findings are significant? That sounds simple. It rarely feels simple. I've become more certain over the years that judgment may be one of the most important outcomes of a doctorate, because researchers repeatedly have to decide what matters and why it matters. And depending on your methods, those decisions may take different forms. This slide addresses a very common misconception. Statistical outputs do not speak for themselves. Numbers require interpretation. I've lost count of the number of times students have proudly shown me statistical outputs while being unable to explain their significance. The numbers are important, but interpretation is equally important, because numbers answer some questions while creating others. And qualitative researchers experience something very similar. This slide contains another important reminder. Themes do not emerge magically. Interpretation is a responsibility. I remember one candidate saying, "The themes just appeared." I gently challenged that statement. Themes are constructed through careful interpretation. They're evidence-based decisions. And understanding that responsibility often creates another experience altogether: self-doubt. This slide captures a stage that many students experience quietly: self-doubt, confusion, frustration. These are common experiences. I've become less certain that confident researchers are those who never feel uncertain. I've become more certain that successful researchers learn how to continue despite uncertainty. And eventually, something interesting begins to happen. Insight arrives. I think this may be my favourite slide in this episode. Insight usually develops gradually through repeated engagement with the data. One thing that still surprises me is how often students expect a single breakthrough moment. Occasionally that happens. More often, understanding builds slowly. You revisit the data, you see other connection, then another, until eventually the story begins to make sense. And perhaps that is why the reflection questions matter so much. This slide asks three excellent questions. What patterns genuinely exist? What surprised me? What do the findings mean? I would encourage you to revisit these repeatedly, because analysis is often an iterative process rather than a one-off activity. Speaking of moving forward, let's briefly look ahead. This slide introduces episode 9, writing the thesis, building the argument. One pattern that still surprises me is how often students assume that analysis and writing are separate activities. In reality, they are deeply connected. Episode 9 explores that transition. But before we finish, let's briefly acknowledge the references. This slide introduces several excellent authors who have helped researchers make sense of complexity for many years. If there's one idea I would like you to remember from this episode, it is this: data rarely gives you answers. Researchers create understanding through careful interpretation, and perhaps that is one of the most important transitions in the entire doctorate. I look forward to seeing you in episode 9.